The Bible in 10 minutes. I'm Pastor Branson Villardo. Thank you for watching. Today we're going to be covering the book of Genesis in 10 minutes. If you haven't already, make sure you like this video and subscribe to our channel for more great videos just like this one. Now, we're covering the book of Genesis in 10 minutes today. I want you to know right from the very beginning, the book of Genesis has four main parts or four main narratives. I'm going to give you a little bit more detail on each one of them. But the four main movements, the four main narratives are this. Number one, from creation to the fall, that takes place from Genesis chapter 1 through Genesis chapter 11 is the ultimate fulfillment of the fall. Number two, you have the Abraham narratives. The Abraham narratives take place from Genesis chapter 12 through Genesis chapter 25. Number three, you have the Jacob narratives. The Jacob narratives take place from Genesis chapter 25, the end of chapter 25, through Genesis chapter 36. And then number four, you have the Joseph narratives, or the Joseph stories, which take place from Genesis 37 through the end of Genesis, which is Genesis chapter 50. Now, let me give you big picture the movements of the book of Genesis. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand not only everything that takes place in the book of Genesis, but the purpose of the book of Genesis and the overall message, not just that each story is sending, but the book as a whole is sending. Genesis chapter 1 through Genesis chapter 11, like I said, marks from God's creation through the fall. You'll remember in Genesis chapter 1, the Bible lays out how God, over the course of 7 days, created the heavens and the earth. Really over the course of 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. Genesis chapter 2 goes into a little bit more detail about how God created Adam and Eve, the first man and the first woman. Genesis chapter 3 talks about how a serpent went into the garden that God placed Adam and Eve in, and the serpent tempted Adam and Eve to eat fruit of a tree that God had commanded them not to, and ultimately they fell for that temptation, and as a result, they're kicked out of the garden. That's how you get to Genesis chapter 4, where Adam and Eve have been kicked out of the garden, and Eve has her first two children named Cain and Abel. As you remember, Cain and Abel both bring an offering to God. Abel brings a first fruit offering, which God is pleased with, of the flocks of sheep. And Cain brings just an offering of his crops, not a first fruit offering though. And God isn't pleased with Cain's offering. Cain gets jealous of Abel as a result. And so Cain ultimately kills Abel. When Abel dies, Adam and Eve have another son. That son's name is Seth. And Seth in the Hebrew means replacement, because Seth was the replacement that God gave for Abel. That's Genesis chapter 4. Now you hear a little bit more about their descendants, and then in Genesis chapter 5 you get into a bit of a genealogy, but the next big story there is Genesis chapter 6, where we're introduced to Noah. We're told that wickedness has started to spread all over the earth, and so in Genesis chapter 6, we're told that God decides he's going to wipe out the entirety of creation except for a few animals and Noah, which he's going to save on an ark along with his family. God starts over with Noah, and the story of the flood is told in Genesis chapter 6 through Genesis chapter 9, and that's the story of Noah and God starting over with him. Unfortunately, Noah's descendants don't do much better than Adam and Eve's descendants, and they also wicked, which leads us to what happens in Genesis chapter 11. In Genesis chapter 11, after a genealogy in Genesis chapter 10, all of humanity comes together and builds a tower so that they can be like God and exalt themselves to be equal with God. That's called the Tower of Babel, and God decides to separate humanity and spread them all over the face of the planet. As he does that, he scatters and confuses their language. And again, he decides to start over with one man. Now, that's the end of the first main part of the book of Genesis, Genesis 1 through Genesis 11. God starts over with another man, and that man's name is Abraham, and that starts off Genesis chapter 12. God calls Abraham into a land that he's going to give him, and that's what happens in Genesis chapter 12. Abraham is supposed to go by himself, but he brings his nephew Lot with him. And so Genesis chapter 13, Abraham has a dispute with his with Lot, his nephew, because they both grow to be too big. They can't live together, so they have to separate. What happens is Lot gets into some trouble, so Abraham has to fight for him. Abraham's promised a child, but at one point, his wife decides that Abraham should sleep with her servant, and so he does. And ultimately, that's how Abraham, through Hagar, has Ishmael, which wasn't God's chosen son for him, but was a son that Abraham had by the strength of his own flesh. After that, ultimately what happens is that God decides to destroy a few cities that have gotten very wicked by fire. He destroys the two most famous ones are Sodom and Gomorrah, and that's where Lot, Abraham's nephew, had ended up living. And so God delivers Abraham's nephew, Lot, out of Sodom and Gomorrah, but destroys those two cities. And then ultimately, Abraham has Isaac, his son, after a visitation from some angels. Once he has Isaac, his son, God asks him to offer Isaac, his son, as a sacrifice, which he does in Genesis chapter 22 to prove his faithfulness to God. Sarah ends up dying. Abraham sends to find a wife for Isaac in Genesis chapter 24. And then ultimately what happens is that Abraham dies in Genesis chapter 25. And that's the end of the Abraham narrative. Now, after the Abraham narrative, we're not told much about Isaac, and we move on to stories about Abraham's grandson, Isaac's second son, Jacob. Jacob takes his older brother Esau's birthright, and that's how his story starts off. Then we're told that Isaac sowed in the midst of famine. Then back to Jacob. Jacob steals the blessing from ultimately Esau, his brother. So he stole first the birthright, then he stole the blessing. You remember he sold the birthright for a bowl of soup, and then he put on hair to steal the blessing. Then we're told that Jacob flees because his brother's mad at him. That's where he meets his wife, and he works for 14 years. Just like he deceived his brother, he was deceived by his father-in-law, who makes him work 7 years for the wrong wife, Leah, and then 7 more years for the right wife, the one he wanted in the first place, Rachel. After that, ultimately, Jacob prospers. He decides to flee his father-in-law's house, which is Laban, and he leaves his father-in-law's house, and he re-encounters his brother who he fled from in the first place, Esau, and they have a family reunion. Jacob wrestles with an angel and gets the name Israel, and then Jacob builds an altar. And then finally, Jacob's beloved wife, Rachel, dies. That's the end of the Jacob narrative, which ends in Genesis chapter 36. Then in Genesis 37, we're told about Jacob's favorite son, who's Joseph. We're told Joseph has dreams that his brothers will bow down to him, but his brothers then sell him into slavery as a result. There's a brief interruption in the stories about Joseph in Genesis chapter 38, where we're told about how Jacob has some children, which we can get more into in some different videos. Then we're back in Genesis 39. We're told about how Joseph prospers in slavery. He rises to be the head of the house where he was a servant, but the head of his master's house, his wife, ends up lying about Joseph, says that he tried to rape her, and so Joseph is taken to prison. Even in prison, though he prospers, he interprets 2 dreams for people who used to be right-hand men to Pharaoh, and his interpretation proves correct, which means when Pharaoh later, many years down the road, has a dream that he needs interpreted, one of the servants remembers Joseph from prison, and he says, oh yeah, that guy can probably help interpret your dream too. And so when he says that, they pull Joseph out of prison. He interprets Pharaoh's dream in Egypt, and Joseph becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man in Egypt. What happens next is that there's a famine in all the world. Joseph helps prepare Egypt for the famine. And so Joseph's old brothers, the one who sent him into slavery, now they have to leave Israel, and they come down to Egypt because that's the only place there's food in the famine. They don't recognize it, but they end up meeting their brother, which they once sold into slavery, Joseph, and they have a family reunion as well. And ultimately, they move all the sons of Israel into the land of Egypt, which is where they'll later be enslaved. In the Bible, the book of Genesis ends with Jacob blessing his sons. Now, that's a quick recap of the book of Genesis. Now, let me real quickly give you the theme. Here's what you find. At the center of all 4 of those movements, there's an important verse. In the first one, which goes from creation through the fall, there's a verse in the middle of the flood where it says, God remembered Noah and he stopped the flood. At the second one, about Abraham, it says that God remembered Abraham and he delivered Lot from the fire in Sodom and Gomorrah. In the third one, it says God remembered Rachel and he gave Rachel children. And in the fourth one, it says that nobody remembered Joseph, but ultimately God remembered Joseph. What's the theme of the book of Genesis? You have it right there. God always remembers his people. Even when people don't remember you, you can trust that God will remember you. The book of Genesis is all about remembering what God did with creation. And the point is this: even though you may not remember God, even though people may not remember God, God always remembers his people, and he's always there to deliver his people. That's the book of Genesis in 10 minutes. We'll have more videos in the days to come in more detail on all these parts of Genesis, but there you have it. That's the book of Genesis in 10 minutes. God bless you. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to our channel and like this video. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe for more.